In 1885, the Congo Basin was assigned to a single individual as private property. It was not a colony of Belgium. It was the personal estate of King Leopold II. The territory was larger than Western Europe. Its people were not consulted. No representative from Africa attended the conference that decided this. Leopold required rubber. Villages were assigned monthly quotas. Those who failed to meet them were punished. The force publique was sent to enforce collection. Hands were severed as proof that bullets had been used. Women and children were held until the rubber arrived. The quotas did not change. The punishments continued. The system ran for over 20 years. Estimates placed the death toll at 10 million people. The exact number is unknown because no one was required to count them. This actually happened. There is a number that historians still argue about. 10 million. Some say it was 8 million. Some say it was more than 12. The argument itself, the inability to agree, the margin of error measured in human lives, is its own kind of answer. We are talking about the Congo Free State, 1885 to 1908, 23 years. And the difficulty in counting the dead is not because the records were lost. It is because for most of that period no one was required to keep them. This is where we have to start, not with the violence itself, but with the architecture that made the violence invisible. In 1884, the major European powers gathered in Berlin to resolve what they called the Congo question. There was no representative from Africa present at that conference. The question was not whether to divide the continent, that was already settled in the minds of the men in the room, but how to divide it without triggering a war between themselves. Otto von Bismarck hosted. 14 nations attended. In the course of a few months, they drew lines across a map of a place most of them had never seen, and when they were done, they had formalized a process that would hollow out an entire continent within a generation. The Congo Basin, roughly the size of Western Europe, was awarded personally to one man, not to Belgium, to King Leopold II as his private property. The legal mechanism was a humanitarian organization he had created called the International Association of the Congo. He had spent years lobbying European governments and the United States, presenting himself as a philanthropist determined to bring civilization and free trade to Central Africa, to suppress the Arab slave trade, to open the region to the world. He was believed, he was trusted, he was given the largest private landholding in human history. What Leopold actually wanted was rubber. By the late 1880s, the invention of the pneumatic tire had transformed rubber from a useful material into an industrial necessity. The Congo rainforest contained enormous quantities of wild rubber vine. The problem was harvesting it. The vines grew scattered through dense jungle. Tapping them was exhausting, dangerous work. It required enormous amounts of human labor, and Leopold needed that labor to be free. So he manufactured the legal basis for forced labor. Under what became known as the Vacant Lands Decrees, the Congo Free State claimed ownership of all land not actively cultivated by Africans. This erased, at a stroke, the entire traditional land use system. Forests used for hunting, for gathering, for spiritual practice, for everything except the European definition of cultivation. It also meant that the rubber in those forests belonged to Leopold's state. Congolese people who harvested it were therefore, by this legal logic, not workers but thieves, unless they were doing it for the state, in which case it was their obligation. This is how you construct forced labor without calling it slavery. You redefine property, you criminalize subsistence, you leave people no option but compliance. Each village was assigned a rubber quota, monthly, non-negotiable. The state's agents, a mix of European officers and locally recruited soldiers, called the force publique, were responsible for collection. Their method of enforcement was not subtle. Villages that failed to meet their quota were burned. Men who resisted were shot. Women and children were taken hostage, held in stockades, sometimes starved, until the men returned with enough rubber to secure their release. And then there was the hand. The force public soldiers were issued rifles and cartridges. Ammunition cost money. To ensure that soldiers were not wasting cartridges on hunting or on personal disputes, commanders required proof that every bullet fired had been used to kill a human being. The proof they demanded was a severed right hand. Soldiers began returning from punitive expeditions with baskets of them. When soldiers fired and missed, or fired at animals, they would cut hands from living people, from children, to account for the spent rounds. A. de Morel, a British shipping clerk working in Antwerp in the late 1890s, noticed something in the cargo manifests. Ships going into the Congo carried guns and ammunition. Ships coming out carried rubber and ivory. There was almost no trade goods going in, the kind of cloth, tools, and metal that you would expect if the rubber were being purchased from free traders. Morel understood what this meant. The rubber was not being bought, it was being taken. The guns were not for protection, they were the means of production. He began publishing what he had found. He was not the first to raise alarms. Baptist missionaries had been sending disturbing reports to London for years, and a handful of journalists had written about the atrocities. But Morel had the documentation. He had the shipping records. He established the Congo Reform Association in 1904 and built one of the first modern international human rights campaigns, enlisting writers, politicians, and public figures on both sides of the Atlantic. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a book about it. Mark Twain wrote a savage satire. Roger Casement, the British consul to the Congo, conducted an official investigation and returned with testimony from survivors that was so methodical, so specific in its detail, names, villages, dates, descriptions of injuries, that it was impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. What Casement found was not chaos, that is the critical thing to understand. What he found was a system. The atrocities were not the result of rogue soldiers or individual cruelty. They were the output of a structure, of quotas and deadlines and accountability mechanisms designed to maximize rubber extraction. The violence was bureaucratic. It had a logic. The severed hands were not random brutality. They were a management tool. This is what makes the Congo Free State significant beyond the scale of its death toll. It demonstrated something specific about how modern administrative systems can be turned toward mass atrocity without requiring the participants to conceive of themselves as monsters. The European officers who ran the system were, most of them, ordinary men operating within institutional incentives. Meet the quota. Maintain order. Show results. The men who cut off hands were soldiers following orders within a system that rewarded compliance and punished failure. Leopold himself, in Brussels, never held a machete. He attended charity galas. He donated to public works. He was, by the standards of European society, a respected head of state. Arendt would write about the banality of evil 50 years later in a different context. But the Congo Free State is an earlier illustration of the same mechanism, of how ordinary institutional logic, stripped of any countervailing moral accountability, produces results indistinguishable from deliberate sadism. The population numbers require some context. The pre-colonial population of the Congo Basin is estimated at somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. By the time Belgian government formally took control from Leopold in 1908, census estimates, fragmentary and unreliable as they were, suggested the population had fallen by roughly half. The causes were multiple, killing directly attributable to the force publique, starvation resulting from the disruption of food production as men were conscripted into rubber collection, disease, particularly smallpox and sleeping sickness, spreading through a population made vulnerable by displacement and malnutrition, and what demographers call excess mortality from reduced birth rates. The children not born because communities had been shattered. 10 million is the figure that appears most often. It may be conservative. The problem is that the baseline population figures are themselves estimates, and the mechanisms of death were so varied that attributing them to the regime rather than to underlying disease patterns requires assumptions that careful historians resist making carelessly. But here is what is not in dispute. The rubber quota system was in effect across large portions of the Congo from roughly 1891 to 1906. The force publique's atrocities are documented in missionary reports, in Casement's investigation, in the testimony of survivors, in the records of the Congo Reform Movement, and, most damningly, in photographs taken by missionaries in the field. A man named Insala, photographed sitting on a mission veranda looking at the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter. The photograph was taken in 1904. His village had failed to meet its rubber quota. That photograph is real. It circulated in reform pamphlets across Europe and America. People saw it. Governments saw it. And for a long time, not enough happened. Leopold's defense was consistent and sophisticated. He acknowledged isolated abuses. He convened his own investigating commission. He argued that reports from missionaries were exaggerated, partisan, motivated by anti-Catholic sentiment or commercial rivalry. He funded counter-propaganda. He retained lawyers and lobbyists. He understood, instinctively, something that would be demonstrated many times in the century that followed: that a government in control of the primary information channels coming out of a territory can sustain a false narrative for a very long time, even in the face of contradictory evidence. The reform campaign took more than a decade to produce concrete results. Casement's report was published in 1904. Belgium did not formally absorb the Congo Free State until 1908. And even then, and this matters, the takeover was not driven primarily by outrage at the killings. It was driven by embarrassment, by diplomatic pressure, by the accumulated reputational damage to a European monarch, and by extension to the project of colonial civilization itself. The Congolese people were not the reason the system changed. The threat to Europe's self-image was. When Belgium took formal control of the Congo in 1908, it did not dismantle the system Leopold had built. It reformed it. The rubber quotas were eventually phased out as wild rubber became less economically viable. Synthetic alternatives were emerging, and the vines themselves had been severely depleted by decades of unsustainable extraction. The force publique remained. The forced labor framework remained, repurposed now for road construction, for porterage, for the extraction of other resources. The fundamental premise remained that the Congo existed to serve external economic interests, and that its people were instruments of that service. This is what colonial takeovers looked like in practice. The scandal had made the specific cruelties of the Leopold era internationally visible. So the specific cruelties were modified. The underlying structure was inherited. Belgium governed the Congo for 52 more years, until independence in 1960. Those decades produced their own forms of violence and dispossession: compulsory crop cultivation, brutal taxation, systematic exclusion of Congolese people from education above a certain level, from skilled trades, from political participation. The population began to recover demographically, which Belgium cited as evidence of improved conditions. What it demonstrated was that the death rate had stopped being catastrophic, not that the colonial relationship had become just. Independence, when it came fast and without preparation, which was not an accident. Belgium had made almost no effort to develop a Congolese professional class, a Congolese civil service, Congolese leadership at any level of administration. In 1960, the Congo had fewer than 30 university graduates in a country of 14 million people. One of them was Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba became the Congo's first prime minister. He was 34 years old. He had been imprisoned by the Belgians just months before independence was declared. At the independence ceremony, with the Belgian king sitting in the front row, he gave a speech that no one had approved and no one expected. A direct account of what colonialism had been, what it had done, what it had cost. He named it. In public, with the architects of it present, he was dead within 7 months. The CIA was involved. Belgium was involved. The Congolese president Kasavubu dismissed him under dubious constitutional authority. He was handed to his enemies in Katanga province, tortured, shot, and his body dissolved in acid so there would be nothing left to become a martyr's grave. A Belgian police commissioner oversaw the disposal. This is the part that histories of the Leopold era sometimes fail to reckon with fully, that the Congo Free State was not a closed chapter. The violence of that period did not produce accountability, did not produce reckoning, did not produce structural change that would protect the people who survived it. It produced a slightly more moderate form of the same colonial relationship, followed by an engineered decolonization designed to preserve Western economic access and eliminate leaders who might threaten it. Mobutu Sese Seko ruled for 32 years after Lumumba's murder. He was a kleptocrat of extraordinary discipline, stealing an estimated $4 to $5 billion from a country whose population remained among the poorest on earth. He was supported financially and diplomatically by the United States and Belgium throughout the Cold War because he was reliably anti-communist and because the Congo's mineral wealth, cobalt, copper, uranium, diamonds, was considered strategically important. The logic was the same logic that had governed Leopold's Congo, wearing different institutional clothes. The extraction continued. The accountability did not. What does this tell us about power? It tells us that power, when it is held without accountability, does not require malice to produce atrocity. That is perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson of the Congo Free State, and it is worth sitting with directly rather than moving past it too quickly. Leopold II was not, by the psychological standards available to us, a sadist. He was an empire builder of the rational, administrative type, obsessed with revenue, with prestige, with the gap between Belgium's modest size and his own ambitions. He wanted wealth and international standing. The severed hands were not what he wanted. They were what his system produced when it optimized for what he did want, in a place where there was no one with the power to stop it. The suffering of Congolese people simply did not enter his calculations as a significant variable. They were inputs. They were labor. They were obstacles. This is not a more comforting account than outright sadism. It is a more disturbing one, because it means that the architecture of atrocity does not require unusual people. It requires ordinary people, ambitious, self-justifying, ideologically cushioned by the racial assumptions of their era, placed inside institutions that reward extraction and face no countervailing force. You do not need to hate the people you are destroying. You need only to be sufficiently indifferent to them, sufficiently insulated from the consequences of your indifference, and sufficiently motivated by something else. Leopold was indifferent. The force public officers were indifferent, or afraid, or compliant in the way that people inside institutions learn to be compliant. The European governments that recognized the Congo Free State in 1885 were not thinking about Congolese people at all. They were thinking about each other, about the balance of imperial power on the continent, about trade access and strategic position. The Congolese were not agents in that calculus. They were a feature of the landscape. This is what the Berlin Conference made visible. The absence of any African representative was not an oversight. It reflected something foundational about how European civilization, at that specific moment of industrialized, racially theorized imperial expansion, understood the category of the human. The people whose land was being divided were not parties to be negotiated with. They were, in the operative ideology of the conference, not yet fully historical subjects. They were being brought into history by Europe as a gift. This ideology was not unique to Leopold. It was the common property of European imperialism in that period, held with varying degrees of conviction and cynicism across Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium. What made Leopold's Congo distinct was not the ideology, but the degree to which the system was optimized for extraction with no moderating influence. No independent press, no civil society, no competing colonial bureaucracy with its own institutional culture, no missionaries with access to legal recourse beyond writing letters. Just a private company with a private army and a direct line to a king who controlled the information coming out. Human nature then, and the lesson is not a flattering one, includes the capacity to build systems of extraordinary cruelty while maintaining a coherent self-image as a civilizing force. The missionaries who documented atrocities were operating out of the same imperial framework as the officers who committed them. They believed in the project of bringing Christianity and civilization to Africa. They simply had a different view of what that required. What separated them from the force publique was not a fundamentally different understanding of Congolese humanity. It was proximity and conscience and the professional obligation to report what they saw. Roger Casement is worth considering here. He was a British imperial official who believed in the British Empire and served it faithfully for years. His investigation of the Congo, and later of atrocities committed against indigenous people in the Peruvian Amazon by a British-registered rubber company, eroded his faith slowly, through contact with evidence that his ideology could not absorb. He eventually became a passionate Irish nationalist, was arrested for attempting to organize Irish rebellion during World War I and was hanged by the British government in 1916. His diaries were used against him. Their content, which was homosexual, was leaked to discredit him and ensure that prominent voices would not call for clemency. The man who had exposed Leopold's Congo was destroyed by the same machinery of reputation management that Leopold had used to survive a decade of reform pressure. This is also part of what the Congo Free State reveals, that the systems that protect impunity are not one-time structures. They are reflexes. They operate across context, across causes, across the line between perpetrator and witness. The photographs still exist. The photograph of Enzala, others like it, taken by missionaries who understood that they were documenting something that words alone would not be believed. They are in archives. Some are in museums. They are among the earliest examples of photography being deliberately used as evidence of human rights abuse. Before that phrase existed, before there was an international legal framework to receive such evidence, before there was a name for what we would now call a crime against humanity. The Congo did not produce any formal reckoning. Leopold was never tried. He kept his personal fortune, his properties, his palaces. He died in 1909, a year after ceding the Congo to the Belgian government, still one of the wealthiest men in Europe. The land he had stripped of millions of people funded Belgian monuments, built public buildings, endowed parks. You can visit some of them today. They are beautiful. And the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo as it is now, remains one of the most resource-rich and most systematically impoverished places on Earth. The eastern provinces have been in near-continuous conflict for 30 years. The cobalt in your phone almost certainly passed through supply chains touching Congolese mines. The extraction has not stopped. The accountability has not arrived. That is not a coincidence. It is a continuity. Remembering the Congo Free State matters not because it is unusually dark in the catalogue of human atrocity, though it is dark enough. It matters because it is a clear case, unusually well documented, unusually analyzable, of exactly how the machinery works, how power insulates itself, how violence is bureaucratized, how ideology provides cover, how reform movements can succeed at changing the visible form of a system while leaving its fundamental structure intact. The 10 million are not a statistic. They are the output of a process that had a logic, that had authors, that had beneficiaries. And understanding that process, tracing it from the conference room in Berlin, to the rubber vines, to the severed hands, to the shipping manifests, to the photographs, to the acid that dissolved Lumumba's bones, is not an academic exercise. It is the minimum requirement for understanding how the world we live in was built and who paid for it. They paid with everything. And most of the world never learned their names.